Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a big one. We're diving into one of history's most influential and honestly most controversial blueprints for society, the Manusmriti. This is an ancient text that really tried to create a complete rulebook for everything.
So let's just jump right in. To even begin to understand why a text like this was created, you have to start with a huge, universal question that thinkers have been wrestling with forever. What happens when there are no rules? I mean, what's humanity really like in its natural state, with no system to guide it?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the problem Manu saw, total anarchy. Then we'll get into his solution, this divine law called Dharma. We'll see how he structured society into 4 parts, how a king was supposed to enforce all of it, and then, finally, we'll grapple with its really complex legacy.
Okay, first up, we need to get inside Manu's head and understand the chaotic world that he believed needed a serious, radical fix. According to Manu, before a state existed, life was basically a nightmare. There were no laws, no order, just complete and utter chaos. This wasn't some romantic idea of freedom, you know? It was seen as the absolute darkest chapter for humanity, a situation that just could not last.
So, how do you fix that? Well, in Manu's version of history, the state didn't just slowly evolve over time. Nope, it was a sudden, top-down, divine intervention. The people were so desperate that they went to the creator, Brahma, who then created the king. And the king's entire job description? Impose order on all that chaos.
Okay, so you've got a king. Now what? A society needs a guiding philosophy, right? Kind of like an operating system for a computer. For Manu, that operating system was Dharma.
Now, Dharma is a huge concept, but the Manusmriti lays it out like a science. It wasn't just some vague, fuzzy idea of being good. It was a concrete set of rules meant to regulate every single part of life: political, economic, family, you name it. The goal was for every person to live by this cosmic social law.
And the foundation of this whole system was built on these 10 key virtues. These weren't just suggestions for being a nice person. Manu saw them as essential behaviors that would stop society from collapsing back into chaos. They were the principles everyone, and I mean everyone, was supposed to live by to make the whole thing work.
So with this philosophy of Dharma in place, how do you actually structure the society itself? Well, Manu lays out a very specific 4-part design which was intended to create perfect harmony and function.
And this brings us to the famous Chaturvarna theory. Society was split into 4 distinct classes, or varnas, and each one was believed to have come from a different part of the creator, Brahma. This story directly tied a person's role in society to a divine cosmic plan. So, the Brahmanas from the head were the thinkers, the Kshatriyas from the arms were the protectors, the Vaishyas from the thighs handled business, and the Shudras from the feet were there to serve the others.
And let's be clear, this system was absolutely rigid. According to Manu, this wasn't just a suggestion box, it was a non-negotiable requirement. If society was going to avoid falling back into that terrible chaos, every Varna had to stick to its specific job. This was the very bedrock of social order. No exceptions.
Okay, so you've got the philosophy and you've got the social structure, but how does the king actually make all this happen day to day? Manu gives him what you could call a divine toolkit.
First thing to understand, the king's power wasn't just political, it was divine. He wasn't just some guy who was good at fighting. He was seen as an entity created by God himself, embodying the qualities of 8 different deities. This gave him the ultimate authority to rule and to use the powerful tools Manu laid out for him.
And here are those tools. Manu detailed 5 main jobs for the king. It covers everything from keeping people in line through punishment to funding the state through taxes and even managing threats from other kingdoms. These were the essential pillars of a stable kingdom. Of all those tools, the most important, by far, was dandaniti, which means punishment. Manu basically believed that human nature was flawed and that fear was the best way to keep people on the straight and narrow. There's this powerful line that says the fear of punishment, or danda, is what protects everyone and keeps society in order even when no one is watching.
Now, it wasn't all about punishment. The king's job was a delicate balancing act. Taxes weren't seen as the king just taking your money. They were a wage the people paid for protection and welfare. In fact, his highest duty was to protect the most vulnerable, orphans, widows, the elderly. But, and this is a really, really critical point, justice was not blind. The system was explicitly unequal, with punishments and rights being completely different depending on which Varna you belong to.
So after walking through this whole incredibly detailed blueprint, how should we think about the Manusmriti today? What's its place in history?
Well, its influence is just undeniable. For a very, very long time, this wasn't just some ancient religious text, it was the standard legal guide for rulers. It profoundly shaped society and was even used by the British to administer law during the colonial era. It had real-world power for centuries.
A pretty useful way to understand Manu's whole approach is to compare it to another famous text, Kautilya's Arthashastra. You could think of it like this. Kautilya was focused on the practical, nitty-gritty stuff of running a state, like spies and government budgets. Manu was focused on the bigger, spiritual picture, sacred law, social duties, and maintaining a divinely ordered society.
But, and this is a huge but, we absolutely cannot ignore why this text is so deeply controversial today. It explicitly justifies the caste system. It lays out unequal punishments, being lenient on upper castes and incredibly harsh on the lower ones. It also defines a subordinate role for women and contains a lot of laws that, by any modern standard, are just completely incompatible with our values of equality and justice.
So in the end, the Manusmriti really is this monumental, all-encompassing blueprint for one very specific vision of a perfect society. It's a massive attempt to create total order out of what was seen as total chaos. And its main tools were divine will, cosmic law, and a deeply rigid social hierarchy.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty tough final question to think about. How do we deal with ancient texts like this? Texts that are, without a doubt, foundational to a civilization's history and law, but at the very same time contain ideas that are profoundly challenging to our modern sense of what's right and wrong.